So yeah, I'm the Director of Nursing Education and Health Studies and Simulation Coordinator at Essex College. All right. So just a little disclosure, I used AI to generate my images that are not real photos. I played around with that for a while and finally got excited about putting out stuff that really looks somewhat real. So the seeds we carry, a family rooted in faith, growing in each new land. So that's the premise behind this entire presentation. These are some Bible verses that speak to me and why I do this study. So I'm an amateur genealogist, amateur historian. My wife and I have been doing that we've been married for 47 years, so probably 45 years together. Her Volga Germans, my Mennonite ancestors. And these two Bible verses are kind of what we use as guiding principles of why we do what we do. The first one is, remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you. Ask your elders, and they will tell you. And that's from Deuteronomy 32:7. And then from Psalms 88:11. Teach me your way, O Lord, that I may walk in your truth. So why is this story so important to me and to others? So many people don't understand the appeal of genealogy. After all, why spend so many countless hours through old records about people that are long gone? Yet even the New Testament includes a genealogy of Jesus Christ. And that shows us how deeply roots can be a matter for us. For some, tracing names, dates, and places is just enough, but not for me or my wife. The true reward lies in uncovering the stories behind those names, their motivations, their struggles, and the decisions that shape their descendants' lives. So what made me today what I am. Our identities today are often built on those choices made generations ago. For Mennonites, like the Schroeders, these choices included major migrations from Western Europe across to the east, down to South Russia, and finally to Kansas. Each move was a leap of faith. It was they left behind familiarity and they left loved ones, but always carrying with them a deep commitment to faith, community, and perseverance. So they carried their seeds of faith and life to meet each challenge along the way. So let's let the saga begin, because that's what this is. Now, I need to make a full disclosure about this presentation. The earliest characters are fictional. I have no way of knowing these people that far back. I do know back into the 1500s, but not to the 1400s. However, their path reflects the real migrations of many Mennonite families, from Frisia to Prussia, then to South Russia, and eventually North America. There will be a point where the characters are true and the issues related to them is absolutely true, and I'll let you know when that is. So why did I write this story? Well, it allowed me to explore how faith, culture, and identity endured across time and distance. I'm inspired by the quiet strength of the Mennonite people, their commitment to peace, community, and resilience in the face of hardship. While this presentation is not a strict historical account, this story is grounded in research, oral histories, and historical context. I hope this presentation offers a glimpse into people and spirit that still resonates today. The morning fog clung to the low fields of Frisia like a woolen blanket left damp by the sea. Isaac Schroeder, a sturdy man with wind-battered hands and quiet gaze, stood barefoot in the peach-rich soil behind his thatched farmhouse. He was born in 1492 in a small hamlet near Vidmarsund, where flat fields and gray skies met the ever-restless North Sea. His people were farmers, herders of sheep, dairy farmers, and diggers of ditches. They were a hardy folk, used to coaxing life from marshy land. The house that Isaac and his wife tended was a classic Frisian farmhouse of its day. It was long and it was low, with a steeply pitched thatch roof that braced against the coastal gales. It was built in the traditional head, neck, torso style. So the front of the house housed the family beneath the dormered windows. There was a narrow middle that connected the house to the working part of the structure, and that was a broad, open hall shared with livestock during the long winters. It was timber-framed and wattle-walled. The cottage bore the scent of peat smoke and damp earth, always a little smoky from the hearth that rarely went cold. Beneath its roof, generations had lived, worked, and worshipped quietly, shielded from the storms of both nature and man. So now I'll give you some context of what was going on during that time. Let's talk about the Reformation, okay? So Mennonite, Martin Luther, and Pope Leo X are the key players in the next chapter of this saga. So during the lives of Martin Luther and Mennonite, the Pope was Leo X. Pope Leo X excommunicated Martin Luther in 1521 after he refused to renounce his writings, while Mennonite renounced the Catholic Church himself and joined the Anabaptists in 1536. He was never directly addressed by Pope Leo X or excommunicated. So by the time Isaac Schroeder reached adulthood, whispers of reform had begun to drift in from the south. Luther's defiance of Rome was a rumor passed between traders and scribes. It was discussed in hushed tones at the local inn over bowls of barley stew and slabs of rye bread smeared with rendered goose fat. Most villagers couldn't read, but they heard enough to know that the world was shifting. The Pope's indulgences, and that was paying the church to get your loved one's soul out of purgatory into heaven, that's what the indulgences were, was once taken as a fact of life by many, but it began to sour in the tongues of simple folk. For Isaac, faith had always been a quiet matter. Prayer before work, scripture read aloud when the priest permitted, hymns sung low during the long winter nights. But after his friend died fighting in a mercenary band under a nobleman's crest, Isaac began to question the world's justice. Why had the church, so rich in gold and silver, done nothing to help his friend's kin? Why did Christ's peace seem absent from every corner of the land? Then in the 1530s came Mennonite. Menno, once a Catholic priest himself, from the very soil of Frisia, began preaching a new way. Radical, some said. He taught that true Christians rejected violence, refused to baptize infants, and lived in community, sharing possessions and bearing each other's burdens. His words reached Schroeder, not in a church, but in a secret meeting in a barn outside Bolsward. There, by flickering candlelight, Isaac heard the gospel again, but with new ears. He was baptized again as an adult. That was a dangerous choice. So now we're going to shift our imagination here, and we're going to imagine that these three characters actually had a meeting, and gives you kind of the foundation of why we have so many Protestant churches. So this is an imagined debate among the reformers. So even though these three characters never met, we can imagine the discussion would have gone something like this over three key factors. One is the Lord's Supper. Luther defended Christ's real presence in the Eucharist, while Zwingli and Simons viewed it primarily as a memorial of faith. The existence of church and state. Luther and Zwingli supported cooperation between church and government, while Simons insisted the church remain separate from political power. And then the issue of baptism. Simons advocated believers' baptism only, while Luther and Zwingli defended infant baptism, because that's how you got people into the rolls for military service, taxes, etc., right? So their disagreements then highlight the theological divisions that occurred and shaped the Protestant Reformation and led to so many new branches of Christianity. Anabaptists were seen as heretics by both the Catholic authorities and the rising Lutheran churches. To be one was to be hunted. The government viewed them as a threat to social order. They refused military service. They rejected state-aligned churches, and they formed their own communities. Schroeder, now a father of four, helped hide fellow believers when government soldiers swept through. He had built a false wall in his barn. He learned to read scripture in Dutch. He huddled beside others during clandestine gatherings, often in forests or abandoned mills. Despite all of this, and despite the risks, everyday life still had to go on. Schroeder farmed flax and rye. He raised cows and chickens. His wife brewed beer and baked dense loaves in a clay oven. Their home was a timber frame cottage, as I mentioned earlier, with wattle and daub walls, thick thatch roofing, and a hearth that never quite lost its smoke. They wore wool spun at home, simple tunics and caps, and clogs carved from elm wood. Meals were humble: porridge, cabbage, dried fish, and maybe off and on a bit of beef. Their church was not a building, but a people. The Anabaptist community called each other brother and sister, trying or striving to imitate the early Christians. They believed in the separation of church and state. It was a radical notion in a world where religious allegiance was enforced by the sword. They sang in secret, a cappella style, voices rising like fog over fields, fragile but defiant. When officers of Charles V came demanding names, Schroeder stood firm. "My allegiance is to Christ," he said. He was fined, beaten once, but spared imprisonment, perhaps due to goodwill of neighbors who respected his quiet dignity, even if they feared his beliefs. In 1550, Mennonite published his Foundation of Christian Doctrine, and by then, Schroeder was an elder in the underground church. He was gray-bearded and thin, but unbroken. He had seen friends executed, homes burned, and children taken. Yet he remained steadfast, tending both his fields and his faith. Isaac died in 1554, buried not in consecrated ground, but beneath the trees behind his home. And that was the Anabaptist custom of the time. No marker bore his name, only a pile of stones placed there by those he loved. But his legacy endured, for it was men and women like Schroeder, unknown, unarmed, unwavering, who carried the torch of a peaceful faith through the fires of persecution. This picture depicts a rural village during this time in 1500s in Frisia, captures the essence of the Frisian countryside life. So it reflects the simplicity and functionality of the village during Schroeder's time. This provides us a glimpse into daily life and the environment of Isaac Schroeder and his fellow Anabaptists in the 16th century. This is a map of Frisia. Amsterdam is down in here, Groningen is here, and so the area in which the geneticist says my genes came from is this area in the circle. So my brother was very upset because he wanted us to be German. I was like, sorry, we're Frisian. Now we're German. I said, no, we're Frisian. Thus we were not Schroeders, right? And then this is a picture of the church that Mennonite was a priest in Wittmarsum. Standing on this site now is a steel structure that's like a skeleton of what the church was. Next, let's look at the themes and the historical significance of my next part of my story. And so it's going to talk about faith under pressure, community over conformity, everyday courage, and then cultural continuity. So Anabaptist Mennonites seeking refuge from persecution in Friesland and Flanders first used sea routes to reach Danzig, which is now Gdansk, and Poland, but Prussia. They traveled from the Low Countries, country ports like Amsterdam, Antwerp, and Emden to get to Danzig. The route was facilitated by existing grain trade routes between the Low Countries and Danzig. In 1534, however, Danzig's city council even asked the port cities to prevent Anabaptists from boarding ships destined for their city. So what did they do? Many chose to go by wagons, having to camp under open skies, share meager rations with other families, and bury family members along the road. all casualties of the hardship. Yet through sorrow and uncertainty, that promise of freedom kept them moving forward. So this shows you the route that they took from this area here, Frisia to the Danzig area here. And then these are other migration routes, but this is the one that we're focusing on here. Isaac's quiet strength shaped future generations. He left us a legacy of resilience, peace, and faith in action. He moved his family, or encouraged his family to move from Frisia to Prussia, which left an unbroken chain of conviction that he left his family with. So now we're going to have a quiet exodus of the family from Frisia to West Prussia. So these are things that happened in the 16th to 18th century. So after Isaac Schroeder's burial beneath the alder trees behind the farmhouse, the silence seemed to deepen across the fields of Frisia. His grave was unmarked, but not forgotten. It was still tended by calloused hands and tearful prayers. In his life, Isaac had been a man of peace. He was plain in dress and firm in faith, passing to his children the Anabaptist convictions that had once nearly cost him everything. He believed in nonviolence, adult baptism, simplicity, and above all, community. Johann Schroeder, his eldest, had listened more than he spoke. From his father, he had learned that the soil never lies, and neither does suffering. As persecution crept closer, its shadow darkening the ditches and dikes of their homeland, Johann watched with quiet resolve. So the Peace of Augsburg had come in 1555, which offered tolerance to the Lutherans, but not to them, not to the radicals. Anabaptists remained the heretics of choice for the Habsburg officials. Even neighbors who once shared bread now turned away, fearful of the imperial fines and scrutiny. So whispers began to circulate. There were travelers' tales, merchant rumors, letters read by candlelight and passed between hands like contraband. East, they said, east to the lands near Danzig, where the Vistula spread its fingers across the flat earth. The Polish crown was Catholic, yes, but tolerant. The Teutonic Order had loosened its grip, and so now the nobles needed settlers. They needed men who knew marshes, who could carve fields from swamp. Mennonites, they said, they're ideal. Johann did not decide quickly, but by the spring of 1563, he gathered with elders in the meeting house. The Lord, he said softly, made Egypt a place of hardship and Goshen a place of refuge. Let us go east. That week, tools were cleaned, books wrapped in wool, seed grain poured into sacks. They sold what they could not carry. They built carts that would carry children, elders, and scripture. A handful of families from Frisia and the neighboring Friesland and Groningen joined them. A quiet people, firm in faith. The journey took months, from Bremen through Brandenburg, across the spine of the German states. They traveled in silence, broken only by prayer and the creak of wagon wheels. Along the way, sympathetic Protestant merchants and villagers, some Lutheran, some Reformed, sheltered them. It is written that one Lutheran blacksmith in Elbing gave them iron nails and a wheel rim, asking for nothing in return. When they reached the lowlands outside of Danzig, they found what had been promised: swamp and silence. But it was familiar. The smell of that brackish water, the flutter of marsh birds, and the stubborn soil. They settled near Company, which is now Kleinlüben, and signed contracts with Polish nobles, desperate to see the land drained and farmed again after the devastating floods of the 1540s. And then they built the heart of the village, the meeting house. Whitewashed walls, hand-carved benches, No altar, no statues, only the word read aloud in Dutch and German. They sang songs, the psalms in slow, solemn tones. In those humble rooms, they stitched their lives together with prayer and discipline. Their contracts, signed with cautious landlords, guaranteed freedom of worship, yet they owed taxes and the sweat of their brow. But they would not bear arms, not for kings, not for crowns. Only for God would they pledge allegiance, and then only in spirit. Johann aged with his fields. He taught his sons to read the land as scripture and to see scripture in the land. When he died sometime in the 1580s, his funeral was as quiet as his father's. That was a simple gravestone, and only the memory of a man who had led his people across half of Europe in search of something simple and rare, the right to believe without fear. By then, his children spoke a mix of Frisian and Dutch, with soft accents of German and an occasional Polish word. His grandchildren, now baptized in adulthood, were still plain in dress, steadfast in conscience, and they would be among the first to call themselves Mennonites, after the beloved preacher Menno Simons. However, they were still outsiders in many ways. Plain dress, quiet lives, and a steadfast refusal to join the military. But in Danzig and the Vistula Delta, they had found something rare, a home where faith could flourish without fear. Now let's take a look at the 1730s, and now things get documented. So Mennonite villages in this region were characterized by linear settlement patterns. Farmsteads were arranged around dikes and canals, which facilitated the drainage and irrigation of their farm ground. They lived in the timber-framed houses. Homes were typically one story with steep thatched roofs again, wooden walls designed to withstand the damp climate. There were windmills used for pumping water from fields. They were essentially managing the marshy terrain. But their community centers. Each village had a meeting house where Mennonites gathered for worship and communal affairs. So now we're going to continue this multi-generational story of my Schroeder family. They're now living in Podwitz and the Schurzi area, areas of West Prussia, where Mennonite life took deep root. We'll pick up in the late 1600s, a few generations later, after the Schroeder family moved east from Frisia. The characters now are ancestrally correct. Jan Schroeder stood at the edge of his field, a wooden hoe balanced loosely across his shoulder. The first light of morning spilled across the flat land, casting long shadows from the alder trees along the canals. He squinted against the sunshine, watching the low fog lift from the ditches his father had helped dig. These canals, these dikes, this stubborn reclaimed marshland, they were his inheritance more than any written deed. In the Vistula Delta between Podwitz and Schurzi, the Mennonite settlements had taken root generations ago, and the Schroeders never left. Jan's grandfather had arrived from Frisia with little more than a cart of tools, his Bible wrapped in wool, and an oath to live peacefully, separately. Jan was born in the Werder's muddy cradle and had never seen Frisia, but he still lived by the old ways. The land, once wet and treacherous, now offered rye, wheat, and sugar beets. Potatoes, strange and knobby things from the Americas, had become a common in Jan's kitchen that he couldn't imagine there without them. Dairy cows fared poorly in the damp environment, so the family kept pigs. It was a trade learned from their Lutheran neighbors, like so many quiet exchanges in these parts. Their home, like all Mennonite houses in the Werder, stood raised on a small mound to prevent it being flooded. It was a longhouse, again, half dwelling, half barn, with a steep thatched roof and timber beams, worn smooth by time. Inside, the floors were packed earth or rough planks. The hearth always smelled of burning peat or alder wood, and at night the family climbed into wooden box beds. They were curtained and closed to keep the warmth in. Maria, Jan's wife, kept the kitchen as steady as the tides. She kneaded sourdough rye in the early dawn and then baked those loaves in outdoor clay ovens. Their meals were simple but generous. potatoes with butter and smoked meat when they had it, cabbage stewed with vinegar and cloves, and always something pickled from the cellar to remind them of the summer. On feast days, Maria might make cheese dumplings or a sweet fruit mousse from the orchard's sour plums. In winter, they drank fermented buttermilk, while in the summer, a low-alcohol beer, because it was safer than the marshy well water. New spices such as caraway, mustard, even cinnamon had slipped into cooking over the years, traded for linen or wool in the Danzig markets. Their children worked alongside them. Heinrich, their eldest, already plowed like a man, though he dreamed like a scholar. Maria and Gretke, both nimble with the spindle and the loom, wove cloth and embroidered linens with careful hands. Heinrich still ran barefoot through the fields, asking more questions than his father could ever answer. But the church was the center of community life. Each Sunday, families walked to the Montel meeting house, where simple worship centered on scripture, prayer, and hymns sung in German. Children learned to read from well-used Dutch primers, while also being taught humility and obedience. The church was also a source of mutual aid. Neighbors shared firewood, water, food, and labor whenever help was needed. Yet Mennonites remained separate from the wider society because they refused military service and oaths. They married only within the faith. That's not true, this is Protestant, and avoided state churches. This distinct way of life marked them as outsiders, even as their honesty, productive farms, and willingness to help during floods earned the respect of all their neighbors. At harvest, Jan would hire Polish Catholic workers or Lutheran Germans from nearby towns. The work was hard, but the men worked in silence, side by side, bound by the rhythm of the land. On weekends, Jan might take wool to Danzig, bartering it for coffee, spice, or a bolt of fine cloth. That was a small luxury to be tucked away into the plainness of his home. By now, Jan's children spoke Plattdeutsch, not the Frisian Dutch of his grandfather. Their German was smoother, their manners slightly more open, yet they still wore plain clothes, still bowed their heads at meals, and still carved wooden toys by hand rather than buying them from the town. It was a changing world. Every man participated in water management. Windmills pumped water to prevent flooding. Jan taught his sons to shovel mud, maintain dikes, and read the land. His legacy is faith, family, and farming were central pillars of life. Above the hearth, on the oldest beam in the house, Jan had carved the words his grandfather once whispered when they prayed against the rising water. Mot und Freiheit is bid is straight and gold. Modesty and peace are better than strife and gold. He read it every night, often with Heinrich beside him. The boy listened, but Jan wondered what he had heard. The world was changing. The dike still held, but for how long? So let's just take a closer look at the marshlands of Jan's time. The Schroeder homestead sat quietly on a man-made mound. That was to prevent, again, flooding. The long timber frame structure rising like a small arc above the flat marshland. It was built from oak and thatched with rye straw. The house was typical for Mennonites of the Werder. Half living space, half barn, sheltering both family and livestock under one roof. The walls bore the scent of peat smoke and wool. The floors were packed earth in the barn and rough some planks in the kitchen and sleeping quarters. Jan Schroeder, like his father before him, spent his days bent to the rhythm of the land. He planted rows of rye and wheat, their golden heads swaying in the breeze each summer. Sugar beets grew dense and heavy in the rich black soil, but that newest crop, potatoes, brought across the ocean from the Americas, had become a quiet revolution. Where rye failed, potatoes thrived. They boiled them with salt and butter, fried them crisp with bits of pork, and stored them in root cellars to survive the long winters. Livestock lived close to the family, as I said. Chickens clucked just beyond the kitchen door, while pigs rooted in the straw. A few cows gave milk, but damp land made dairy a struggle. Instead, meat, smoked and salted, became more common than in the old Frisian days. Jan, as I said earlier, raised pigs for their lard and sausages, a practice he had learned from the Lutheran neighbors. His wife, Maria, was the steward of the hearth and of their evolving diet. She pickled cabbage and cucumbers in clay crocks lined with vinegar and horseradish. She smoked slabs of pork above the fire and packed them in barrels with layers of salt. Sunday brought stews made of cabbage, cloves, and leftover grain, or sweet dumplings with fruit mousse from the orchard's cherry trees. The children drank that fermented buttermilk or thin beer because clean water was a rarity in these lowlands. Life here was labor, but not drudgery. In winter, Jan repaired tools in his shed, his hands as capable with the rasp and hammer as they were with the plow. He could fashion a wagon wheel as neatly as he hoed a row. Maria spun flax into linen, her daughters at her side, weaving thread into dresses and kerchiefs for the household. Her oldest, also Maria, embroidered small verses into the hems with red thread, often in Dutch or Plattdeutsch, sometimes in German, depending on what books had survived the damp environment. The greatest labor of all, though, was not in the field or in the kitchen, it was in the water. Every man in the village was a part-time engineer. Windmills turned steadily on the horizon, powering pumps that drained the canals. Canals bled into ditches, and ditches into the Vistula, if all worked well. Jan had spent his youth shoveling mud to build up the dikes, and now he taught his sons to do the same. Without the dikes, he said, we are nothing but fish. Even with the hard work and simple meals, the house was warm with purpose. It was not a rich life, but a good one again. Their faith grounded them. On Sundays, they walked to Montel, where the congregation met in plain-looking buildings. There were no bells, no crucifixes, no priestly robes, just elders, scripture, and song. Men and women sat separately, and sermons were spoken Low German or High German, depending on the elder. Outside the meeting house, children ran barefoot, and men had quiet trades that were being arranged, such as flax for pork, rye for soap, or wool for spices brought from Danzig. Maria's kitchen bore traces of these exchanges. She had caraway from a Lutheran trader, mustard seed from a Polish woman in Schroeder. Occasionally, cinnamon or nutmeg found its way into her hands, and she would use it sparingly, always with a prayer of thanks. Though the Schroeders lived apart from the world, they were never truly alone. They hired Polish laborers for harvest, bought salt from Lutheran merchants, and sold wool and linen in the Danzig markets. Their conversations were polite, but distant, often framed by mutual need. Still, a quiet respect lingered, born of shared soil and shared survival. Over time, language shifted. Those children no longer spoke the Frisian dialect of their great-grandparents. Their German grew softer, broader. They called it Plattdeutsch, the Mennonite tongue that carried whispers of Dutch, German, and something entirely their own. But the customs remained. The clothing stayed plain. The prayers were still whispered at night in the same cadence, even if the vowels had drifted. And above the hearth, carved deep into the wood by Jan's own hand, was his family's enduring truth. Modesty and peace are better than strife and gold. Now we're going to shift to the next part of this saga, a decision to leave. So this is the next emotional chapter of the Schroeder's journey. And in this part, they're going to have just arrived after months of arduous travel into the Molossian colony, specifically the newly forming village of Alexandrople in 1820. What waited them was not a promised land ready to receive them, but a vast, unfamiliar, and untamed steppe. Heinrich Schroeder's decision to immigrate was transformative. They established a new life in a land where they could freely practice their faith, govern themselves, and prosper economically. However, this migration not only endured the survival of their religious community, but also set the stage for future generations to continue their traditions in this supportive environment. So leaving again was painful. Friends and neighbors begged the family to stay, but Heinrich saw a different future, one where his children could farm in peace, worship freely, and maintain their Mennonite heritage. In 1820, he sold the farm and packed their belongings into 2 covered wagons. Agatha, his wife, carried her German Bible in a linen satchel. Their eldest son, Heinrich, Just 12 drove one wagon, while the younger siblings rode beside sacks of flour and farm tools. When Heinrich Schroeder stepped down from the wagon and pressed his boot into the wild grass of the steppe, he felt the silence burst. There were no trees, no fences, no church bells, only wind, ceaseless and dry, brushing across the endless plains. He had imagined a land of plenty that was promised by the Tsar himself, but what he saw instead was a vast emptiness. No homes, no wells, just surveyor's stakes and distant murmurs from the wagons behind them. The land had been a gift, but it came with no shelter and no certainty. And so along the way, they met Alexander I, thusly Alexander's well-wish. And then just a side note, my wife, Cindy, is of Volga German descent, and her family went to the Volga River area in 1769, and all of them had to go to Lomonosov, Russia, which is up from St. Petersburg now. And she greeted every ship, every passenger. So 2 generations, two families met, grandmother and grandson. The 20 or so families who would form Alexandreville camped their first night in a shallow valley, circling their wagons against the wind. Heinrich, his wife Agatha, and their children helped build the first Erputen, simple earthen huts dug into the ground and roofed with grass and timber. Damp and crowded, they were nevertheless offered shelter from the harsh steppe winds. With few trees nearby, fuel was scarce. Families burned sun-dried cow dung, flodden, and twisted grass bundles, carefully conserving every spark. Clean water required hand-dug wells, often 30 feet deep. Neighbors lowered one another by rope as they worked. When the first bucket of clear water was finally raised, the settlers sang Psalms 23 with tears of gratitude. They named their village Alexandreville, Alexander's well wishes, to honor the Tsar who provided this settlement. Church for those first years was held in homes. The Frisian families and the Flemish families worshipped in their homes side by side, reading scripture by candlelight and singing the old hymns in Plattdeutsch, their Low German dialect. Services were led by elders chosen from among them, plain men, not preachers, who emphasized humility, mutual accountability, and the enduring grace of God. Heinrich believed their suffering was a trial, not a punishment. Our ancestors fled Friesland to follow their conscience, he reminded his children. We have come farther, but for the same reason. As the settlement took shape, homes were raised with clay and timber, whitewashed inside and out. The village followed Mennonite order, 2 straight rows of houses facing a central street, each farmstead with its allotted 175 acres stretching behind it. The Schroeder house, though modest, had a central oven and later a red tile roof brought at great cost from the distant Melitopol. So this is an actual picture of Heinrich Schroeder's house that he built, lot number 11, and then this is lot 12. So you can see the similarities of the houses. Farming the southern plains was unlike anything they'd known in West Prussia. The black soil was fertile but unbroken, wild, compact, stubborn. Mennonite plows, light and wooden, often failed. Heinrich and Peter hired local Ukrainian oxen drivers to help, exchanging wool and bread for muscle and know-how. They learned to reinforce their wagons with iron rims and adapted their dress, linen trousers and long Russian tunics to block the sun. Their first harvests were meager, as hailstorms bruised their crops. A late frost killed half the vegetable beds. That first winter, the Schroeders rationed salt cabbage and dried beans, living mostly on coarse bread and what little game they could snare. Still, Heinrich never spoke of returning. This land, he said, is not cursed, it is waiting. Though they held tightly to their culture, the Mennonites could not ignore their neighbors. They bartered with Tatars, Russians, and Ukrainians, exchanging textiles and smoked meat for livestock, milk, and occasional help. A kind of quiet diplomacy emerged, trade over tea, mutual aid during storms, and then shared concerns when wolves circled too close to the barns. There were tensions, of course, arguments over land boundaries, suspicions over religion, But Heinrich believed in neighborliness. He taught his sons to speak a little Russian and to deal with fairness, even when fairness was not returned. By 1830, the wild steppe had softened. Wheat fields waved gold in the sun. The Schroeder family had built not just a house, but a farm. They had a barn, a smokehouse, and vegetable garden. There was the young plum tree that grew in the courtyard planted 5 years earlier with the last handful of loamy soil from Prussia. Peter, now a married man with a home of his own, that's my great-great-grandfather, in the nearby village of Landskrona, came often with his children. Heinrich, white-bearded and stooped, would sit beneath the plum tree, listening to the laughter of his grandchildren and the rustle of the grain in the wind. He no longer saw a barren plain. He saw a village, his village, and on a wooden beam above the kitchen door, carved with Peter's steady hand, were the words his father had whispered so often: "Ein niet lande, ein elle Glaube," a new land and old faith. And by the time Heinrich Schroeder passed in the early 1840s, that once barren land of Alexandria had become a tapestry of fields and faith, threaded with wheat and hymns. His son, Peter Schroeder, now a man of stature and foresight, left that village of his youth and struck out toward the heart of the Molochna colony. He settled in Landskrona, seeking better soil and a role in the village council. But his journey did not end there, for in the 1850s, Peter married Sarah Penner of Mennonite, a woman of clear mind and deep conviction. She came from the Kirchlich Mennonites, a more structured, church-centered branch of their faith. After marrying Sarah, and though they now lived in Landskrona, they continued attending the church in Runerweide. That was a Frisian Mennonite church, where his soul had first been shaped by the praise of the prairie wind. And this is a picture of Peter and Sarah. Landskrona was not a pioneer village. It bore the marks of progress and permanence. It did not have a church building at its heart, because this village belonged to the wider Ensemble church community. While Peter and Sarah's children were raised in this village, their religious life remained tied to the Runerweide's simpler Frisian congregation. On most Sundays, they made the journey by wagon to attend services in the old meeting house, where the benches were still backless and the songs were sung from memory. The schoolhouse in Landskrona echoed with lessons in reading, arithmetic, and catechism, all taught in High German. Boys and girls studied side by side, carrying their slates and their ink pots, their hands often more callous from farm chores than writing drills. Sarah managed the household with calm efficiency. Like most Mennonite women, her role was central but quiet, preserving food, tending the garden, churning butter, and teaching her daughters the old proverbs and lullabies of their faith. Their vegetable garden, just outside the kitchen window, overflowed with onions, cabbage, beets, and potatoes, flanked by rows of apple and cherry trees, planted in careful sequence. It was a narrow path that led to the beehives, tended mostly by the children, who learned to walk softly and speak low around the hives.
Okay. Sorry, this slide might have skipped or something.
This is the one I just did.
Okay, I think I pressed something, but Gary, I'm sorry.
Okay.
But you're on the right, if you do know which one's the right one.
Yeah, this one. Yeah. So this is in Landskrona. Their home was like many in the Molochna, a single-story farmhouse made of red brick in this village, with a thatched roof later replaced by shingles as prosperity allowed. The central room had a large table for communal meals, a roaring oven, and shelves lined with jars of preserved fruit. Off to the side, small bedrooms were curtained off for privacy. The red brick houses were quite attractive, so the local Russians called it Krasny Drevnya, Red Village. They had barns and outbuildings. They raised livestock. They had cattle, chickens, and horses, and they all roamed the pastures that were not fenced. Peter, his youngest, along with hired hands, tended to those. And their farm life and the prosperity was learned through Johann Cornies, who kind of dictated what and how they were going to farm the land. The Mennonites also developed the German red cow to meet the practical needs of their farming communities, focusing on a dual-purpose breed that could provide both high-quality milk and meat, hardy and adaptable. The German red cow thrived in various climates and supported the Mennonites' self-sufficient lifestyle. Up until the war, because they didn't know about after the war, or during the war, You could be driving through Ukraine and still see pastures of the German red cow. The Mennonites introduced advanced agricultural implements from Prussia and among the Odessa German colonies, including cast iron four-cart plows and seed drills. These innovations significantly increased crop yields and earned the admiration of neighboring farmers. As farming prosperity grew, they needed windmills and which became the symbol of industry and self-sufficiency. So on windy days, the creaking of the village windmill could be heard across the plain, grinding grain into flour. It was a sound that signaled not just survival, but prosperity. I've been through all of the Moloshna colony and other colonies, and there's only one that pretty much still stands. There's no blades and that type of stuff, but all the internal works are still there. While men managed the fields and councils, women were the hidden engine of the Moloshna farms. Sarah trained her daughters in cheese making and tincture brewing, passing down generations of kitchen wisdom. The family table was never empty, even in lean seasons, thanks to her planning. There were jars of pickled vegetables, smoked meats in the cellar, sacks of dried apples hanging from the rafters. She also taught songs, lullabies in Plattdeutsch, psalms in German, and prayers whispered during storms or childbirth. The hearth, she said, was as sacred as the church, if it was kept with reverence. Let's keep looking ahead to the next generation. As Moloshna's population grew, available land did not. Farms that once supported families could no longer be divided among all the sons, creating a growing class of landless laborers who had little opportunity to own property. Peter, a successful farmer in Landskrona, employed Mennonite and Ukrainian workers and treated them fairly. Yet economic divisions became more noticeable. Some feared the community was drifting from its tradition of brotherhood and equality. Despite these challenges, Mennonites maintained strong mutual support through church aid, shared insurance, and communal grain reserves that helped families recover from hardships. By 1870, Peter's eldest son, also named Peter, had married a Voth, a Flemish Mennonite girl from Landskrona, and moved to his grandparent Penner's farm in Gnadensfeld and assumed a growing share of the farm work. He was fluent in both Plattdeutsch and Russian, comfortable speaking to merchants from Tokmak and dealing with the Tatar herders who passed through with their sheep. The land had changed then, but had not erased them. They still sang the old hymns, still planted Turkey red wheat, and still gathered under plum trees to tell the stories of Heinrich and that first hard winter in Alexander. They no longer just survived. They had built homes, farms, schools, churches, and lives on a land that once only held wind. So this is a map of the Moloshna colony, and so the things that are underlined are the main villages that I've been talking about here. So now we're going to talk about what brought them to Kansas. A major factor in Peter's decision to immigrate was his experience in the Podwad service during the Crimean War. At 15, he joined other Mennonites hauling military supplies, wounded soldiers, and provisions after village elders accepted the duty to avoid conscription and heavy fines. What began as a source of pride quickly became a burden. Peter traveled through war-torn villages marked by destruction, death, and suffering. He witnessed devastated fields, battlefield casualties, and wounded soldiers whose pain left a lasting impression. The Mennonite wagon teams provided logistical support while trying to remain faithful to their pacifist beliefs. Near Alma, Peter saw an officer strike Elder Johann Weems for refusing to transport rifles. That night, Johann prayed that God would keep their hearts pure amid the violence of war. This experience convinced Peter that peace and faith were worth preserving, even if it meant eventually leaving Russia. Peter later said that the Podwad years aged him before his time. Though he never fought, he carried the war in its suffering, destruction, and memories. Decades later, the sounds and smells of fire and thunder still recall the Crimea campaign. When rumors spread in the 1870s that Russia would end the military exemption, Peter resolved that his sons would not face conscription. So by 1871, Peter Schroeder was a respected leader in the Alexandral Church. He was a successful farmer in Genanfeld and the head of a growing family. From his whitewashed farmhouse surrounded by orchards, beehives, and productive fields, he often reflected on his grandfather Heinrich, who had once lived a simple dirt dugout in the same land. The village now reflected Mennonite industry and faith. A thriving church, a language school, a well-managed farm with barns, windmills, and livestock. The Schroeder's mud brick home stood amid fields of wheat, barley, oats, and corn. Yet beneath this prosperity, the soil and the times were beginning to change. In the early 1870s, Tsar Alexander II decided to introduce reforms that alarmed the Mennonite communities. Their long-standing exemption from military service was revoked, requiring Mennonite men to serve and challenging their commitment to nonviolence. Additional reforms limited land ownership and inheritance, while imposing the Russian language instruction and greater government control over their schools and their churches. These changes threatened Mennonite self-governance, faith, and cultural identity. As concerns grew, Peter, his neighbors, and relatives gathered to pray and discuss a pressing question: should they leave? On April 11, 1874, General Edward von Todleben met with Molossian Mennonite elders on behalf of the Tsar. And what he came to tell them was that they were going to allow them to have a non-combatant role. They would be required to transport medical aid, help with rebuilding of any devastated areas. So the impact was that Mennonites could serve without violating their faith. But immigration was not an unfamiliar concept. Letters arrived from Mennonites who had already crossed the ocean, describing vast, empty lands in North America, where one could farm without interference and worship without fear. Mennonite delegates met with President Grant of the United States, and others met with the Tsar, all trying to reach agreements that affect the decision of whether to stay or to leave for the Americas. Peter's eldest son, also named Peter, was now in his teens and facing a hard truth. Land in Molossian had become scarce. With each generation, farms were divided smaller and smaller. Many young men now worked as tenant farmers or connected, which are hired hands on land they would never own. The conscription law struck a nerve. For the Schroeders, whose lives were woven from the threads of peace and scripture, the idea of military service was unacceptable. Peter Sr. was torn. He had built a life from the soil of South Russia, watched it bloom from the dust to abundance. But his mother-in-law, Katerina Unruvoz, a woman of firm resolve, urged him forward. You do not abandon the faith to hold on to land, she told him. You take the faith with you. So in 1874, with heavy hearts and resolute purpose, the Schroeders sold their property in Genanfeld and began preparations to emigrate. That was no easy feat. The family liquidated their assets, livestock, tools, grain, and even the windmill, and packed what they could carry. The journey from Genanfeld to Hamburg was long and difficult, first by wagon and then by train. And then they had the harrowing wait at the port. The transatlantic crossing for my family was on the Teutonia, not the Zimbria, like many of the Alexander rulers. It was filled with sickness and sorrow. Many fell ill, and some never made it. But Peter clung to hope. His wife at his side, his children close. He thought of Heinrich and that first trek across Prussia, through Danzig to the Vistula Delta, then to Russia. He whispered old prayers and watched the horizon. So they're waiting at Teutonia, and you can see how crowded the steerage area was of the ship. And then they landed in New York at Castle Garden, because Ellis Island was not in existence at that time. And then they crossed over the river to the train station. And then my family, the Schroeders, actually got off in Newton, not in Peabody, like many of the group that came from around the Zimbria. And then up north to the Gossel area. When the Schroeder family finally disembarked in New York, they made their way west to Kansas, drawn by the promise of fertile prairie land and religious freedom. They settled near what is now Gossel, in Marion County, one of several Mennonite enclaves taking root in the American Midwest. Here, Peter found echoes of Genanfeld, There were rolling plains, the scent of wheat in the air, neighbors who spoke Plattdeutsch and German, and a government that allowed them to live by conscience. The family quickly established a new homestead, modeled after the Russian one. They planted gardens, they dug wells, they built barns, and before long constructed the new Mennonite church where Peter resumed his role as elder. And then this is a picture that a reporter from Topeka was sent to find out about these strange people that have come to that area. And this is from a sketch that they put into the newspaper. And so this, if you go to the Mennonite Heritage and Agricultural Museum on the west end, there's kind of a depiction of this on that end there. So many people, including my Schroeders, they got there in September, and by October, they already were in their own home because they didn't find this appealing to live that way. Plus they had crop rotation and advanced plowing techniques ensured good yields even in this unfamiliar soil for them. They had brought seed preservation methods that helped sustain their crops, though they did find unpredictable weather. By the late 1880s, the Schroeders once again were thriving, but now in a land of liberty. Peter Sr., older now, spent his evenings on the porch of his new whitewashed home, watching the fields stretch westward under the Kansas sun. His grandchildren played in the garden. His son worked the fields. His wife, so firm and wise, preserved fruit and recited psalms by memory. He often thought of his grandfather's dugout in Olive's Honorable, of the wind on the steppe. Why did he miss that in Kansas? Of his father's quiet prayers and the loss of two small children on the trek from South Russia. Somewhere, we don't know for sure, but they lost a son, and then she was pregnant on the trip and lost that child in Lincoln, Nebraska when they stopped there. In his quiet resolve, he remembered that God had led them here and that the land had changed them, and they in turn are changing the land. By the turn of the 20th century, the spelling of my name changed. Now they were U.S. citizens. Family was well established in Kansas, with their farms thriving, their children educated, and their faith at the heart of their community. The struggles and sacrifices of their early years in the Malashna had shaped them into a resilient, innovative, and close-knit family. So we can once again say the land had changed them, and they in turn had changed the land. As they looked forward or towards the future, the Schroeders knew that they had persevered through a hardship of the Russian steppe and the challenges of a new land. They had laid down roots in the rich soil of Kansas, not only as farmers, but as contributors to the American agricultural revolution. They came to Kansas with little more than their faith. They had their hand-selected wheat seeds and farming knowledge. And now in a new land, they had built a community, a testament to their resilience and enduring Mennonite values. And this is my great-grandparents, Peter W. and Helena Schroeder. And so advances happened very rapidly. So this presentation, the seeds we carried, was a dual metaphor. They carried physical seeds, the turkey red wheat that fed an empire, but they also carried behavioral seeds, pacifism, community mutual aid, and an unbreakable resilience. All of that was transformed into every ecosystem that they touched. And I particularly like this quote, however, I can't confirm that he actually ever said it, but it's attributed to him. You don't have a future unless you know your history, and I firmly believe they always say if you don't know history, you're bound to repeat it. Well, sometimes it's good to repeat it. And then this is my bibliography. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, I got the mic here if anybody would like mic. The one. I have one. Just in the process of researching this, is there anything that you learned about your family that sort of most surprised you or really struck you like a fact or a source or something like that?
So I guess I've been immersed in it since my teenage years, coming here for summers and staying with my grandparents and listening to my grandfather go through the Peter Unruh genealogy book and talking about all these stories and all those type of things. there were some like early type things that I had, some misconceptions about the Mennonite faith and that kind of stuff that my mind or my thinking was changed on that. But yeah, mostly not. But also, I always thought the Flemish were more conservative than the Frisian, and then I found out it was actually opposite.
Okay, I'm back here now.
Do you have any idea how the war in Ukraine has changed the buildings that are left? You mentioned the windmill. Any ideas on that?
So from my contacts there, so in Genanfeld or in Hauptstadt was the Heinrich Schroeder motor factory. The son, the Heinrich of the Heinrich that I talked about, brother of Peter, first Peter. It was his motor factory, and I understand that because it was known in there that it was the Heinrich Schroeder motor factory, that was Nazi, and so they blew it up. They tried to blow up a mill in Hauptstadt, or well, Molchansk now. But yeah, so I'm glad that Cindy and I went when we did again, and I got all those pictures and such of all the buildings in that area. So one of the things that my wife and I have done is we have actually visited every village that we can identify of both her family, her dad's family, her mother's family, my mother's family, my dad's family, but all the extended in my family as well. So we've been to Ireland, we've been to Germany, we've been all over Russia and Ukraine and such, Poland. So, except I haven't been to Volhynia yet.
Yeah,
I gotta get there yet.
that's really cool. I think one of the cool things about genealogy and family history is if you get interested in it, you end up researching more about the lives of not the history makers, the wealthy and the nobility, but normal people from the past and farmers and the merchants and stuff. So that's really cool.
I sure like my wife and her mother's family he was a knight in King Henry VIII's court. And then he was given land in Ireland when King Henry VIII dissolved in monasteries.
Cool. I have a question or an observation in this question, but the observation is I have pictures of my great grandparents who were the immigrants.
Mhm.
And they remind me of your pictures. No one looked very happy. What was the deal?
So old cameras, you had to sit still. Because if and so the easiest way, smiling, we cannot hold a smile for very long. Otherwise it blurs. And so that's why. And then like the charcoal drawing picture, a lot of those were actually taken from photographs that, like they were sitting separately. And in order to make them larger, but not larger, they had artists who drew charcoal drawing, drew them so they were together. So if you go to the museum, you'll see those pictures, like you can see the photograph and then you see the larger charcoal drawing as well.
We can assume they could smile. But,
Yeah, but in talking to great aunts and as such, I'm never sure that my great grandmother ever smiled. They said she was just a sober, she lost several children and, during hardship. And so, except she was the main bread baker for Alexanderville Church for any conference or any meeting that was there. And so I guess, she had Christian kindness, but it was like, no, she was not a friendly person. So,
well, then my question is, how did you do this research? Where did you go to do all this research?
so family journals, family books, those type of things. So the family from Heinrich down were from family stuff. The previous stuff is just taking, my wife so she goes to bed at 3 o'clock because she's online in European catacombs and archives and such, doing genealogy work and that kind of stuff. And so in order to get them while they're open, she has to be up all night doing that. So So she's done a lot of this research and finding out stuff about family. She's been in court records, finding out that the father of Jan had been convicted, well, was accused of murder of his wife. And somebody translated it as that he pushed her to hang, but if you interpret it, it's that he wasn't supportive of her depression. And so by not being supportive of her, she committed suicide. So, but it's amazing what's out there. And she's into old newspapers and all of that kind of stuff. So like she reads the Rundschau, which is a Mennonite paper that was printed in Elkhart, Indiana. So.
And we should mention, you have a companion presentation to this one that we're planning. We haven't scheduled it yet, but you're planning to bring that one to the library as well, sometime in the fall probably. So.
And that one is all the pictures from this whole story. So you're going to see these actual villages, what they look like, and this previous decade, haven't been back since COVID. So, but and adding to those sites this story, not as in depth as this, but yeah. So you'll see these actual places, what they look like today.
Just in Russia or in Poland too?
So for my family, Frisia, Russia, and we know Kansas. And then I've slipped in some of my wife's stuff just because we are family, you know, so, and she influences my beliefs and I influence her beliefs, so I can't leave that behind. But yeah, so we've been everywhere.
Great. Well, Greg, Verla wanted to say hello. She's on the chat. So Verla Unruh, she says hello. She's watching. There's some more time. We close at 8. There's some more time for us all to chat once we adjourn. So let's give Greg another round of applause. And thank you all for joining us on Zoom. I'll sign that part off now. Bye-bye.